I want to talk about is the final section of your paper requires you to give reasons for your decisions, what you think that the person should do. And you're trying to answer the question, why do you think that? More than that, why do you think that? And more than that, why should anyone else think that? And that's an important test of whether our own reasoning is solid. To ask whether the reasons that we give to ourselves as reasons for our own choices would count as reasons for someone else. And that's not an abstract theoretical issue. And the reason for that is it's very easy to fool ourselves with bad reasoning for a couple of causes. There's an intellectual laziness that leads us to accept easy answers, to not to do the hard work of figuring out what our principles actually are and what reasons we have for holding them. And there's also an ethical laziness that motivates us to excuse ourselves from difficult choices. Doing the right thing is usually not easy. And developing our character is much more difficult than making one right choice in one moment. So we can use reason in a bad way, an illegitimate way, to talk ourselves out of the hard work of becoming better people. Now the point, and I'm sure you get this sense from me already, is not that we should conform ourselves to other people's value systems that we don't believe in ourselves. The 2 points I want to make is that we want to choose values that we really do believe in. And the way we become secure in our beliefs is to test those beliefs. And the best test of our beliefs is articulating our reasons to other people, especially other people we respect, and to see if they see flaws in our own reasoning. Flaws that we ourselves would, when we hear them, would shake our faith in our own principles, so that we see that we don't really believe in the principles that we have chosen for ourselves. And the goal is to make choices consistently and coherently day after day so that it's a way of life, and not just so that our values become a way of life and not just something that we call on when we're in a crisis. So one of the most powerful tools we have for motivating ourselves to live by our own principles is to articulate the reasons why we hold those values. And this is the slide that really went with the things that I just said. And so that's why we need reasons. So the question is, how do we give reasons to ourselves for ethical principles that might count as reasons for someone else? This is what I'm asking you to do in the last part of the paper. And there's not a simple method I can offer you for doing that. What I can offer you is to talk about and remind you of the ways that each of the four philosophers give principles for their views. So let's look at what Mill did about this. So Mill defends the GHP with reasons by taking Bentham's form of utilitarianism, which has been widely rejected because of its perceived weaknesses and limitations. And he sets out to answer all of the objections and accusations that have been brought against that theory. And in the process, he discredits some of the explanations as untrue or unjustified. And then he also, when he finds justified objections, he will revise, renovate the theory to avoid objections. And you can think about that idea of renovation, that Mill kind of moves into Bentham's house and says, no, it's a pretty good house. It has some flaws, but it's good enough that we shouldn't just demolish it and build a new house. We should actually renovate it and maybe expand it a little bit to fix up what's wrong with it. And once we do that, it's going to be a very habitable house. Now, Kant, of course, takes a radically different approach to that. Kant wants to build his own house from the ground up. And he starts, like a good philosopher, by going to the heart of things and asking what makes reason reason. What is rationality in the first place? And as we talked about, Kant's answer is what makes reason reason is the ability to grasp universality and necessity, that there are certain things that are true always and everywhere. And so then he asks, what would it be like to make ethical choices in a way that expresses universality and necessity? And in the process, he wants to make ethics as much as possible like astrophysics. And that would be to find one principle that's analogous to gravity that can essentially explain everything. Aristotle also wants to make ethics like a science, but his model is biology and not physics. So he wants to ask first, what is the human organism? What kind of animal is the human being? And then to ask, how can we choose a way of life, or what way of life should we choose in order to thrive as the kind of living being, the kind of organism that we are? What's necessary for us to do? How should we live in order to be fully alive? And Held takes a different view from all three of them, a different way of giving reasons for her claims. And of course, one of the things we've talked about is that Held's conception of what reason is broader than anyone else's. Held wants to say that our emotions, for instance, and like empathy, for instance, are part of our rationality. They're not something separate from reason. So Held wants to enlarge what we understand to be reasons, and therefore what we understand to be rational behavior. So how does she do that? She looks at the dominant moral theory. She looks at what most people think of as ethical behavior. And what does she do? She wants to say the way that the dominant moral theories look at ethical decision-making leaves out very important factors. And the analogy I would give you for this, and it's not her analogy, it's mine, is the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So the electromagnetic spectrum consists of visible light in the middle, and it's visible means visible to us. This is the light that human beings can see, the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that the human beings can see, the colors that are visible to us. But that's not the entirety of the electromagnetic spectrum. The entirety of the spectrum includes two other kinds of light and a bunch of other stuff. But the two other kinds of light, infrared light, that has frequencies that are too low for us to see with our naked eye, and ultraviolet light, which has frequencies that are too high for us to see with the naked eye, right? And so what do you do to remedy the fact that human beings can only see visible light? Well, you have special equipment like infrared goggles, night vision goggles that soldiers use, for instance, to be able to reveal the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that is not visible to us with the naked eye. And so what is the analogy that I'm trying to draw there? Held wants to say that mainstream ethical theories are like seeing the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and that this masculinist lens allows us to see the visible colors. And she doesn't want to say this is a mistake, right? The visible colors are there, right? They're an accurate way of seeing the world. It's just that they're a limited way of seeing the world. And what Held proposes is that we add a feminist lens, so to speak. And by lens, I don't mean something like these, but something more drastic than that, like infrared goggles, that will make visible aspects of ethical life that are not seen by dominant ethical theories. And those aspects are aspects like care, empathy, prerequisites of autonomy, that sort of thing. Okay. So finally, I want to give you, and then I'll give you a chance to ask a few questions since we do have time for that. I want to give you two philosophical principles for giving reasons for claims, two philosophical principles of explanation. And those two principles are called, these are the technical philosophical terms for them. One, inference to best explanation, and two, avoiding reductionism. And the point of principle number two is to correct back when principle number one goes too far. And we'll talk about what going too far means. And so here's the first principle, the principle of inference to best explanation. So what this principle tries to do is to give the simplest explanation that we can that will cover all of the relevant phenomena that we're trying to explain. And so the most famous example of this is Copernicus's way of showing us that the best way to explain what we're seeing in the night sky, the way the planets move through the night sky over the course of the years, is to assume that the Earth revolves around the sun. When before, most people thought that the sun revolved around the Earth and the sun was the center of the universe, or at least the solar system. What's wrong with that explanation? If the sun orbits around the Earth, then you have to give very complex explanations of how it is that certain planets at certain times of the year, and Mars is the biggest example of this, appear to move backwards in the sky. So Mars goes, woo, 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 right? You have to give a really complicated explanation of how that's the case if you assume that the sun orbits the Earth. If you reverse that expectation, that assumption, and you say that the Earth orbits the sun, suddenly it makes perfect sense, right? If the Earth orbits the sun and all the other planets, like Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, also orbit the sun, it gives a very simple explanation of how it is that Mars, for example, moves backwards in the sky at one point in the year. And that process of inference to best explanation, where if you have 7 explanations for something, if you get it down to 3 explanations, that's better. That's an example of inference to best explanation. And if you can get the 3 principles down to 1, that's the ultimate of inference to best explanation. And that is a fundamentally reductive process. You're trying to reduce many principles to one principle or to just a few principles. There's a problem, though, which that is that the reductive procedure of the inference to best explanation can go too far. It can over-reduce. And I'll start with an example here because I think you'll get this immediately. So doctors use vital signs to determine whether somebody is healthy or sick the first few minutes they're in the doctor's office. So they'll take your temperature, they'll take your pulse, your heart rate, they'll observe your respiration, they'll use a pulse oximeter to measure your blood oxygen. That's the thing that goes on the end of your finger. And they use that to determine in a general way if you're healthy or sick. But what if a doctor decided only to use one vital sign, right? If she reduced, she said, let's do inference to best explanation. Most people who have a fever are sick, right? So I'm going to use that single vital sign to determine in general whether someone is healthy or sick. So how might that principle be? Okay, someone is healthy if their body temperature is below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You may already see what's wrong with this. Now that would cover a whole lot of cases of health and disease, but it would miss a lot of other cases of illness because many illnesses don't cause fevers, right? So you've already got a problem in that it's going to cover some illnesses, but not others. You're going to have some unhealthy people who have a disease, but they don't have a fever. But the most problematic example is if that's your principle, it would declare someone who is actually dead as healthy, because dead people generally have a body temperature very much below 100 degrees, right? So that's a case where inference to best explanation would have gone too far by reducing down to fewer principles than you need to actually cover all the phenomena that are to be explained by the principle. So that what philosophers say is that's a principle. When that happens, when inference to best explanation goes too far, you have a principle that is reductionistic. It's not just reductive, it's reductionistic in that it simplifies too far to cover all of the phenomena that you're trying to explain. Okay. And of course, Held and Aristotle believe that philosophers like Kant and Mill, so Kant wants to give one principle, Mill wants to cover one principle, have one principle that covers all of moral life. And both Aristotle and Held are going to agree that Kant and Mill have gone too far in the inference to best explanation, that in fact it's impossible to have an ethical theory that covers the full complexity of moral life, that only has one explanation. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, as you're going through the exercise of giving reasons for what you say the person ought to do in your article, in the situation in your article, and you're giving reasons for that. When you're giving your reasons, first, am I using this procedure of inference to best explanation, giving as few explanations as necessary and as simple explanations as necessary? And then second, if I'm using inference to best explanation, am I going so far with it that my explanation is reductionistic? And in fact, I need to pull back and make my reason a little more complex. Okay, so you can also, you ask yourself those those two questions, but also think of the ways that the four theorists that we've studied, the way they have given reasons for their claims. Mill by answering objections, Kant by saying what really makes something rational, Aristotle by asking what is the human being and what's a good life for a human being, and then Held by saying what is there in the complexity of moral life that the dominant ethical theories have missed because they're using a limited masculinist lens.